because flashback as a term, from when I was looking into the history of the diagnosis of HPPD, it was like flashback was sort of like the sort of quick term to describe HPPD. Flashback and HPPD were the same thing. And I know that in psychedelic culture right now and in the research, there's a complex relationship to that terminology because of how it has been represented hasn't really been accurate. And like terms like bad trip, I think there's sort of a press back to be like, oh, like flashback isn't a thing. It's just like leftovers from the ignorance of the drug war propaganda against psychedelics, and stuff like this. And I'm wondering if you can comment there about flashbacks, and in particular, if you could weave in, as you're talking about psychedelic flashbacks, what they are, what they're not, how they relate to HPPD, is whether or not, it needs to be a psychedelic, such as could it be cannabis, which might be counted as a psychedelic actually, especially depending on high doses, and whether or not it needs to be drug induced at all. Because I know one thing that's going around now in the culture is like, yeah, HPPD is a thing, but it mostly happens. There's a vast amount of people who get it not associated to drugs. And so we shouldn't attribute psychedelics to HPPD, like we got to keep this perspective. We got to keep the brand clean here or something like that. There's a lot to speak to there. But that's sort of flashbacks and whether or not drugs need to be involved.
Right. Yeah. The flashback issue, the thing is, most people not in the community, so to speak, don't know what psychedelics really are about. But I'd venture that everyone, my family and teachers at school included, had heard of flashbacks before. So it kind of speaks to just how much that term and it's kind of associated, and it is basically a propaganda term, has penetrated how people perceive psychedelics. But for what it's worth, I was reading about the flashback. I was reading about the history of the kind of flashback literature before this podcast. It seems to begin with a particular paper by this guy Horowitz in '69. So this is a couple of years after the Summer of Love. LSD use was declining, and you're starting to see, and obviously there was the existing turning tide about how clinicians thought about psychedelics. Obviously they were initially perceived by many as being very promising, captured by the counterculture, more uncontrolled settings. You start seeing people freaking out. Mm-hmm. And Horowitz, I believe, based his writing on people who had gone to the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic. So this was a community-run health clinic in the Haight-Ashbury district in San Francisco, which was the epicenter of the psychedelic revolution.
Totally, like hippie central. Yeah.
And I believe that they had, if I recall, by 1969, around about 50,000 people come in through various different things, and a lot of people coming in having panic reaction to psychedelics, a lot of people with STDs, STIs, people with heroin addiction, methadone addiction, etc. But some portion of the people who had experimented with psychedelics, when interviewed by Horowitz, reported that they'd noticed certain, let's say, I think that the phrase he uses is spontaneously occurring phenomena. And so Horowitz and this other guy, Schick, the following year, they were the two main, the two first scientists to document the phenomenon. But I'll start with Horowitz. So Horowitz's paper, it describes a number of case studies through the Haight-Ashbury Free Clinic, and it's like clearly colored by a negative lens on psychedelics. It's very, it's just perfect for like journalistic copy at the time. So one case study he describes is this 17-year-old who he seems to have been a pretty eccentric character, because he was like, Horowitz describes him singing a song of LSD and speed are for me, like just singing this song. Anyway, this guy taken a lot of trips, and he has started noticing quite vivid pseudo hallucinations of scorpions overrunning his body. Another guy which I believe this is a woman, was having intense sort of prophetic visions of her getting into car crashes. And Horowitz described, so it's very wide-ranging, the flashback phenomenon. And then you see Schick come in the following year, and he codified 3 different kinds of flashback. You had the perceptual flashback, which was it could include very vivid things like the scorpion guy or the car crash woman, or it could have been, spontaneously occurring geometric phenomena. I didn't see much HPPD style stuff like visual snow in these papers. But anyway, so you have the perceptual flashback, you have the mood flashback. So I heard, so Schick writes about someone who would just have spontaneous onsets of depressive mood, which she attributed to a particular LSD trip. And you had somatic flashbacks. So from the outset, it was a very broad phenomenon. But it's the kind of the conceptual core of it was the idea of the spontaneous occurrence. And then flashbacks, as you say, they were captured by a certain wing of the drug warrior anti-psychedelic wing. And I was just reading before this about the Narconon program, which is run by the Church of Scientology. Oh, wow. And for what it's worth, they've captured a lot of, if you look up drug risk online, Narconon appears all the time. I mean, in the UK, where the Church of Scientology isn't prominent at all, you see their pamphlets being given out, I believe, to schools. And they related flashbacks to L. Ron Hubbard's New Life detoxification program, where you could clean all the drugs out of your system. You could clean it all out of your spine. Because that was a kind of parallel.
LSD was in your spinal cord and it was like releasing back into your brain. Yeah.
Right. I was just at drinks the other day and talking to a friend of mine who was at school in the early 2000s, and he was saying how in his drug education classes, they would still parroting this bullshit that LSD accumulates in your spine. And if you click it in the wrong way, you're going to have a flashback. So it's obviously bullshit, but that end of it. But flashbacks, so as I say, from the outset, a very broad, fuzzy phenomenon, and it seems that the emphasis in the clinical literature is to move away from that term, because if only because it's so toxic and it's been so weaponized. But that said, I was describing at the start of the podcast that there are 2 types of HPPD. You have the type 1, which is like the flashback, the spontaneous occurrence. But interestingly, in the literature, there's a tendency to describe the type 1 flashback phenomenon as being positive, which it seems to be a lot of the time. But then other people find their spontaneous flashbacks actually quite distressing. So maybe that's another room for kind of for evolution in the literature. And whether HPPD really is the same thing, these 2 types, I'm not sure, because there seems to be quite a strong difference between it being a kind of an invested feature of your whole way of experiencing the world versus just spontaneously happening. But I think that's just why we need more research, because speaking as someone who has read the literature but is still not a scientist, I have no idea what is going on when you have a spontaneous re-experiencing.